Hi, podcast listeners. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. We have so many guests on this show making a difference in our lives, making a difference all around the world with the expertise that they bring. And yet so many of you are reaching out to me saying, you want more. It's not enough just what we're putting on these podcast episodes for you. And so I am here to extend a very warm welcome to you to our Difference Maker community, where you can join for as little as $5 a month to get all this extra content. Out the gate, you're going to get 30 plus mini-sodes of exclusive content not available for the regular podcast listeners, and an exclusive mini-sode every month. And you'll get exclusive voting power to help us pick podcast topics and more. And that's at our Changers tier. There's 3 different main tiers and then an extra larger tier. But whatever tier that you join at, you will be included in this extra content. And I know that many of you are wanting to go a little bit deeper. And so even though it gets a little wild in there sometimes because of how deep we go, I want you to join us there. This extra content is very special. It means a great deal to me to be a part of this community with you. And I would love to just exchange ideas or perspectives that you have around these different episodes. And that's the place where we do it. So please show up to our Difference Maker community. Give us $5 out of your pocket every month. And I think that you'll have a lot of fun in there because we do. And I would love for you to join us. So go to patreon.com/A World of Difference to join us there. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. I'm Lori Adams Brown, and this is a podcast for those who are different and want to make a difference. Happy Indigenous Peoples Day and happy Hispanic or Latinx Heritage Month. We are having a special guest today for both of these events, which is Frank Carbajal. I'm excited to introduce him to you if you don't already know who he is. Frank is the founder of Es Tiempo, and he's also the founder of Silicon Valley Latino Leadership Summit. He has written several books, including a book that's coming out next month in November, Latinx Business Success. Frank has interviewed many Latinx leaders, and he posts all their stories on LinkedIn. And so if you don't follow him there already, please do. It is an honor to welcome to today's show none other than Frank Carbajal. Hello, Frank. Welcome to the World of Difference podcast.
Good morning. How are you, Lori?
I'm doing very well today. It's so lovely to see you and finally meet you virtually after we've been friends on LinkedIn for a while. For my audience who doesn't already know who you are, I'd love for you to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your family and your background and what you're currently doing.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And yes, it's great to be connected with yourself as well as all of the folks that we know mutually. You know, it's really about building the relationships for leadership. And for me personally, I learned at a young age. My name is Frank Carbajal, but I was born as Francisco Javier Carbajal. My parents, immigrants from Mexico, they arrived to the U.S. During what they called the Bracero program, and that was a migrant to citizenship program during the era of the 50s and 60s. I was born in 1969. My parents, I was born in California, first generation, but I wasn't born too far from the border. I was born 40 miles north of the border in a small town known as El Centro, California, which is in Imperial Valley. So my parents, being migrant farm workers, in the early 70s, my dad and mom were offered jobs in canaries. So as you know, in Los Gatos, it was made up of orchards, and you still see some of those beautiful trees in Saratoga and these very affluent areas throughout the Silicon Valley were orchards where a lot of the migrant workers picked fruit. And my parents worked in canaries, but seasonally, I remember working in the summers, in those hot summers, picking fruit with my parents. So I always say, Lori, and to the audience listening, my DNA is made up of fruit and vegetables. So I have a healthy DNA.
That's awesome. Yes, at a time when people are trying to get their kids to go back to healthy food, you just were raised with it. And what a beautiful story of your parents helping feed a nation. And we just, our hats are off to them for that really hard work, especially during the hot summers. It's no joke what people have to go through. We see that here in California, don't we? When we're driving past down to Monterey or wherever we're going, we see the hard work that's being done there. So yeah, it's significant.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I also belong to a local Toastmasters, and one of my colleagues who is a member, he's from Singapore, but he's in technology and he's been, working in the U.S. for over 25 years. So much where his oldest daughter is a student at Cal Poly. And one day I presented on the migrant farm work of resiliency. And he called me and he says, I just want to thank you because you provided me with some history when I was driving my daughter down 101 in the Salinas area. He's like, I had no idea of the hard work in 2020. This was last year during COVID, the height of COVID, all of the uh, immigrants working out there,
Yeah.
so hard, and some, at the beginning stages of the pandemic weren't wearing masks. And he's like, Frank, I just want to thank you and your parents for uh, showing how, as you had mentioned, Lori, how many of the parents and grandparents are making those sacrifices today to feed America. And I really appreciate, the acknowledgement because it really does take the awareness to understand the really hard work and the grit that are within these family members.
Oh, it's so true. Yes, and yeah, and having lived in Singapore for 10 years, where your friend's from, there's not a lot of food that's grown in the island of Singapore. It's mostly brought in from Malaysia. So but people go into Malaysia all the time just to buy gas. I mean, you just cross the causeway. But we would go into Malaysia as a family quite often, and you see these. They bring in workers from other countries there as well to, harvest different foods and palm oil plantations and that type of thing. So depending on where people have grown up, they may or may not know where their food comes from, right? Here in California, we do tend to drive past it if you're a road trip kind of family. One of the things I wanted to highlight today with you, though, is you have started this Silicon Valley Latino Leadership Summit, as well as Es Tiempo, and you've been a founder of a few things. You've also written a great book that's coming out, which we'll talk about a little bit. But when people think about the Latinx community, there's just all different jobs that Latinos are doing in our nation, right? It's there's a lot of stereotypes around Latinos, which are very unfortunate, and we'll get to that too. But what was it that led you to found the Silicon Valley Latino Leadership Summit and Es Tiempo, and how does it speak into all these things?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I like to always provide, background of why I created the Silicon Valley Latino Leadership Summit and why I started Es Tiempo, It's Time, in translation to English, is because my background, as I'd mentioned, my parents working in the farm, migrant farm working community and canneries in the early 90s. These canneries in the Silicon Valley, and you're local, so you're in the area of the Silicon Valley. So there's an area known as it's an affluent area, Willow Glen, and
Mm-hmm.
Willow Glen had a cannery known as Del Monte. Del Monte, they still have the big can there in the Willow Glen area. For the listeners, Willow Glen is west of San Jose, California. And so my mom worked in this cannery for 35 years
Wow.
and retired from there on her feet. And you can imagine it's like Frederick Taylor's theory of, a cog in the wheel.
Yeah.
These were Latinos cog in the wheel, day after day, time and motion. And so that was part of my mom's work. And my dad's work was also in a cannery. But when these canneries were outsourced and they were moved into the Central Valley area, my parents literally, well, my mom had been at that cannery for 35 years, so she was fortunate to retire. But my dad was at his height of his career in a cannery, so he had to pivot and find another job. So in the early 90s, I remember he went to a janitorial service known as CET, which is a job for Latinos and Latinas to understand and work in an occupation where they could excel, in an occupation, whether it's in mechanics or, essentially working with your hands. And
Mm-hmm.
so I remember the stories that my dad would share with me as he was working as a janitor. He understood the importance of an education, and not taking anything away from, occupation of working, as a janitor or mechanic, but these are things that my dad didn't want me to do. And so I remember he had asked me to visit him one day at his job site to see what he did. And I did. And I realized how much pride my father took in cleaning and mopping the floors. And I realized at that point that my dad was a perfectionist at his job. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to perfect a sense of who I was as a person and my identity as a first generation. And Lori, you hear that term, first gen. Well, first gen is just that. It's a person that is first generation American, American Latino, and first gen to go to college and step into college. So in the early 90s, I was in San Jose State University. And I think what really accelerated my motivation was to see how my parents worked. But after graduating from college and after my master's program, I worked as a first gen professional. And this is where you hear that theory and that identity of the imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Well, imposter syndrome, as you've done some coaching and you've talked to clients, what is that? Well, interestingly enough, Lori, I didn't really feel like an imposter.
Right.
I felt that grit. I always felt the ganas, as they say in Spanish, is the will to succeed. So I was opposite of an imposter. I felt like a competitive person because of the nature of my parents coming to the U.S. and the nature of playing sports and being involved in soccer and track and cross country. I always felt that there was another finish line. When you finish one, you continue to go. And so in the early 2000s, as a first gen professional, I looked around me and the question of the stereotype and the profiling really set in. It really resonated with me that you were absolutely right, Lori, and to all your listeners, when you read, newspapers daily, now it's all digital reading. I remember reading the San Jose Mercury News on the perception and the stereotypes of Latinx and, at that point, Latino, Hispanics being incarcerated, showing the profiles of negativity. And at that point, I really felt the need for the Latinx community to hear about positive stories, positive perception, changing the narrative. And so I was at a conference in the early 2000s, and it happened to be the National Society of Hispanic MBA conference. Wonderful Latinx speakers that happened to be executives, entrepreneurs, venture capitalists that happened to be Latinx, look like me, talk like me, same community, that common thread. But what I realized was, okay, what's next? What's happening when I leave this conference? Do I leave with a book on these stories? There wasn't a book. So I Googled Latino authors and who are out there providing these stories. And that resource fell short. There wasn't many. So I was excited to start writing a book in the early 2000s in profiling these prominent stories. But when I thought about it, I remember there was a couple of people I ran the idea by. My wife, she's like, wow, that's exciting, a huge undertaking. And then my dad. And my dad, I remember sharing the story with him in Spanish. He says, well, mijo, ya es tiempo. It's time. And so that is the birth of the thought to take into action. And I created it as a sole proprietor at the beginning. And then in the mid 2000s, when I really felt the buy-in from folks believing in my book and my manuscript, I talked to a friend of mine. His name's Clay, who's an attorney, and we created an LLC out of Es Tiempo. And my book first book, Building the Latino Future, Success Stories for the Next Generation, was published by Wiley in 2008. And that's where the book was born. But in 2009, with, the market really down, I had to pivot, as we're doing today. I then talked to an executive mentor, a dear friend of mine, Dick Gonzalez, who says, Frank, you should start a leadership summit where folks who aren't going to purchase your book have access to these thought leaders in person. So in 2010, the Silicon Valley Latino Leadership was born, as I say.
Oh, it's so beautiful. I love, on this Changemaker series that we're in, so much of it is people who are trying to change culture and may feel like an underdog at times. And there is a level of grit and competition and all that we see here a lot in the Silicon Valley among first gen of immigrant families. It's a lot of resilience. It's going against the grain, but that's where the change often happens, is that people who are on the sidelines, on the margins, coming in to join this game that was rules not created by them nor for them. So it's always more difficult, always an uphill battle. But there's, I have such admiration for you and all that you've done to not only help your voice be heard, but to bring people around you whose voices aren't heard and help change the narrative on what people's perceptions are. I mean, certainly I have grown up seeing Latinos in all kinds of jobs and, having grown up in Latin America, but there are a lot of people in the US context and even other countries who have still bought into certain stereotypes. And I love that your book interviews all different kinds of people and you've been able to meet amazing people. I know that they've inspired you, and that's why you have written these books. But you have a new book coming out next month called Latinx Business Success. So what is that book about? No, you don't have to give any spoilers away because I want people to buy your book. But give us a compelling reason as to why we should buy it and read it.
Yeah, Lori, it really didn't happen until the pandemic. And I think one of the things that we've learned is to, as I mentioned, the word pivot, but pivot is a word, and taking action is, the step toward your goals. And it really came into my thinking and my mindset at the beginning stages of the pandemic, where I learned that, as you had mentioned, marginalized communities. I grew up in East San Jose. Today, I live in Santa Clara, but I'm always giving back to East San Jose. Why? Because those are my roots. That's my foundation. That's really a reflection of who I am when I look in the mirror. And so when I was looking in the mirror and looking at, knock on wood, that I wasn't exposed to COVID early on, I knew a lot of family members and Latinx community members that had COVID early on. But more importantly, the students, the young generation, because that is the future. And what I learned was how many didn't have broadband and had a lack of Wi-Fi issues. The digital divide was so prevalent that it really became relevant in terms of what I thought. And I thought, okay, I have built a network and an ecosystem within our community that are digital evolvers. And what I mean by that are folks that have done successfully well in terms of their position in tech companies that have climbed that corporate ladder in technology, which is difficult, very difficult. But then I thought, okay, these young kids in East San Jose, why do they not have access to my network? Well, Lori, one thing you've learned from me through LinkedIn is I'm very transparent, I'm very accessible, and I think it's very important to provide my resources. And I thought, well, how do I do that? Well, I already created the first book, and I don't like being a hidden agenda or hiding a secret sauce. I like providing that salsa, that tapatio, that form, that form that really gets folks going. And I think that's how I am. I'm a person that really believes in giving back, and how I thought about the book Latinx business success is creating a digital framework. And, I'm glad you asked about giving secrets away. It's not something I'm hiding. I feel that it's important for folks to know, listening, that my new book that is released in mid-November, you're exactly right, exactly a month from now, will be on a digital framework that provides these modules that really are incorporating these stories, not only folks in tech, but folks in media, entertainment, folks that are physicians that were also, I call them frontline thought leaders, because not only are they thought leaders, but they were putting their life in danger, and they happen to be Latinx. And so for me, it's important that the digital evolution uh, is inclusive of folks that happen to be in school today. And so that's why it's so relevant, because, I'm a father of 3 daughters, and I thought, well, my daughters are fortunate, but if I think about it, Lori, and I was that kid in East San Jose growing up today, and there was a pandemic in the 80s when I was in high school, I would have probably dropped out of high school.
Yeah.
So for me, it was a pressing issue, because no kid should be left behind in terms of Wi-Fi connection and disparities.
Oh, yes, wholeheartedly agree. I just think I look at, I know, several people here in the Silicon Valley that grew up in East San Jose and feel very similarly to what you feel. There's so much potential there. There's future leaders that are growing up there, and what a shame that just some of our systems left them behind. And so, those of us who are able to help speak into the changes, we absolutely must, because we need those future leaders. We don't know what they're going to grow up to become, whether it's business leaders, government leaders, finding cures for cancer and different, pandemic issues of the future. Hopefully not, but there's brains there, there's perspectives there that we need as a society. And so we, coming together to help make those systems more easy for them when life is already so hard. I mean, it's the very least we could be a part of. One, question I wanted to talk to you about a little bit too is when we sometimes people think they'll take a group of people and make it just like this monolith that everyone's the same. That's what stereotypes do. So when we think of the Latinx community, obviously you and I see a lot of nuance there, but maybe not everybody does. Some people will say things like stop Asian hate, and they're just thinking of Asians as one kind of person, right? There's a lot. Asia's a big continent, right? But also when it comes to Latinx community, there's even Indigenous peoples represented within the Latinx community. So we celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day yesterday. I certainly, growing up in Venezuela, we had a very different perspective of Christopher Columbus than maybe some white, Americans do. And so Indigenous Peoples Day was something I sort of, intuitively understood because of how I grew up hearing about Indigenous peoples in Venezuela and the Amazon and different things. And so, when we think about the Latinx community and the variety of people even coming across our border to come and, immigrate here, many are Spanish speakers, but often many are bilingual. They speak other languages from Central America and different places. And so what is your perspective on why it's important to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, especially in light of our past?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, because I think it's a question that stems way back from hundreds of years ago. And the thing that we have to look at is, in terms of history, and not only in the US, but in Mexico and Central America and South America, are the indigenous roots prior to Spaniards going to South America, Central America, and Mexico. And you had mentioned it, you hit it on the head about dialects and languages. Indigenous means that. It means language, means perspective and cultural enrichedness. And so when I look at both, and I look at Indigenous and the term Latinx, I just want to make sure that folks who have said, well, Frank, why, and asked me why the X, because your first book is Building the Latino Future. Well, the X, of course, folks see as gender neutrality, right? For me, I want to make sure that I highlight the X being an intersection of coming together, inclusivity. And so that tying into People's Day yesterday instead of Columbus Day, it's because it is inclusive of everyone to understand the history, and understanding the history in terms of the richness and the diversity within, our history of the communities of South America, Central America, Mexico, and the Americas of the United States. Because it really, Lori, it really starts early. It starts early on. I don't know if you saw my post last week, but Gavin Newsom, he has made it by 2030, all high schools have a requirement of ethnic studies. Well, I'm not running for politics, but I would even take it a step further and say it should be a requirement in elementary school. And, think about it, Lori, when we were both, say, in elementary school, you forge the relationships with kids and understandings of cultures and acculturation and appreciating another person's culture at a very young age.
Yeah.
At a very young age. And, I love this question so much that I was thinking about it on my drive home, because I dropped off my daughter at school today. And one of the things that I like to share is, I have 3 daughters. I have my oldest daughter, my middle daughter who's disabled, and my youngest daughter. But my middle daughter with disabilities, when I dropped her off at her school, it was interesting because when they opened the door this morning, they were showing videos on Christopher Columbus.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And I thought it's not the teachers, but it's the system.
Yeah.
You said it right. You said it right. It's the decision makers. And so I always say that in terms of decisions, it's not that one thinks, oh, I'm just going to show this video. It's just that it's something that really is still of a mindset. Like, for example, yesterday I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's non-Latino, and they said, well, on the East Coast, we don't have a problem with it. We still have many schools say Christopher Columbus Day or Christopher Columbus holiday.
Wow.
And I said, well, with President Biden, maybe there's some changes, and there's changes, as I mentioned, with Governor Newsom with ethnic studies, but it really has to be sustainable. It has to be a plan of action that is very much not long term, but for life. And I think you and I understand it, because you had mentioned your upbringing of where, your professional career, as well as living in Latin America. You lived in Singapore. But for folks who are of the mindset of the colleague that's non-Latino that said, oh, I don't have a problem with it. Well, the majority of America is divisive in terms of the term. And so I am so glad you asked that, because to all the listeners, please remember that in Latinx, the X for me personally is inclusion. It's intersection. It's coming together.
Yeah. No, I love that. It's, we do have in Spanish, obviously the O and the A indicate, female and male. But, and so this is kind of creating something new that's a different word than actually existed in order to be inclusive. And I think that's what, this is all about, is maybe some of the old systems aren't working for everyone. And it's always our job in every generation to look at the systems and say who's benefiting and who's not. And so that leads me to my next question, which is a 2-part question for you, which is, what are some of the stereotypes that you think hold back the Latinx community in the workforce and society here in the States? But also, what are you most proud of about your Latinx heritage?
I think the stereotypes that hold many folks back, from the outside, if someone's looking into the Silicon Valley and they see with the respect to service jobs, and then they see the division of service jobs to technology, they're not going to be paying attention to the Latinx community excelling in technology, because they're going to be saying within themselves and behind closed doors, which is even scarier
Yeah.
that the service community is made up of the Latinx community, and that's something that personally bothers me because it's of servitude in the wrong manner. And
Yeah.
I say that it's important for us as a Latinx community to educate folks. As you know, Lori, that's one of my initiatives is the hashtag 365 Latinx leader, hashtag 365 Latina leaders, hashtag 365 Latino leader, because I'm putting it out to the world, not into a cloud and hiding it, uh, but current day of all the leaders that are leading in technology and all other sectors that happen to be leadership roles. And for me personally, I think that service jobs is something that is of a stereotype for many outside of the Latinx community, and they continue to portray the Latinx community as such.
Yeah.
And one thing I'm most proud of is how on October 16th, 2020, I started that initiative of the 365 Latino leader. And that hashtag has been so relevant to many folks, sending me personal messages and providing me thanks. And I'm like, it's not about me, it's about folks that are doing it. We've been doing this together.
It's so true. I've been encouraged by that. There are some amazing Latinx leaders out there, and some of them I already knew about, and some I didn't yet know. And so, follow this hashtag, everyone. We'll put it in the show notes. My last main question for you, Francisco, I'll call you by your Spanish name, is who's a change maker that you admire that has inspired you?
Something that I have to say, of course, outside of my parents, I would have to say Ricardo Montalban. I'm 52 years old, but he was a pioneer in the Hollywood industry
Yeah.
where literally as a kid in the 1970s and early 80s watching Fantasy Island. And I think many of us as Latinx community, fantasize about, living dreams and fulfilling these dreams. And what he did was he led a cast and he led, ratings that were so skyrocketed high that he put Latinos on the map. And one thing I mentioned is, as you notice, he didn't change his name. Ricardo Montalban. He
Yeah.
kept his Latino name and he kept his Latino identity. So it ties into everything I mentioned today. He wasn't an imposter. He was himself. He
Yeah.
was he was amazing, and also Star Trek and all these other great iconic movies that he was part of.
Yes, just another testimony to how representation in the media industry really does matter. We need to see our people that look like us and inspire us. And I'm so glad you had him, and so many others did too. Well, thanks for being with us today. Where can people follow your writing and your work?
Yes, so people can follow me at LinkedIn. Thank you for saying Francisco, but on LinkedIn it's Frank Carbajal. Last name is Carbajal, and my email Frank at Es Tiempo, ESTIEMPO.com. And look out for my book. It will be out in mid-November, and you'll be energized by a lot of these stories.
Thanks so much for your time today, Frank. God bless you.
God bless. Thank you all. Thank you all for listening.
Well, I hope that you really enjoyed that as much as I did. Frank Carbajal is just an amazing leader here in the Silicon Valley and throughout the United States and around the world for people who are following his writing and what he's putting out there in terms of encouraging us to learn more about Latinx leaders in all different jobs and workspaces, from government to tech to different leadership roles around our society and in our world. And I love his story of his family and what they taught him and the resiliency of that, and how important family is to him even now, and to give back to his community in East San Jose. He is the kind of leader that is making changes. He's a true change maker, but he's also inspiring us to not just help ourselves rise, but to help everyone around us rise together. And I hope you will follow him on LinkedIn if you don't already. He has so many inspirational stories of leaders that he's interviewed personally and knows personally through the Leadership Summit and through the work that he did to write his book. And also hope that you'll check out his book that's coming out next month, The Latinx Business Success. There's lots of wonderful nuggets in there for us to all learn from. And I know you'll want to buy his book and pre-order it as it comes out next month in November. And it's a great way to hear at the end of Latinx Heritage Month to read Latinx authors. If you don't already have lots and lots of books by Latinx authors out there, then add him to your list. Also, happy to announce that next week we have Nona Jones on the podcast. Yes, the amazing, successful, inspiring Nona Jones, who seems to be doing so many wonderful things with her life. We're going to talk about her books. We're going to talk about her ministry through her church, where she and her husband are pastors in Florida. We're going to talk about her work at Facebook with faith-based partnerships that she does. We're also going to talk about the amazing organization that she started shortly after George Floyd was murdered. It's called Faith and Prejudice. If you're not already following them, you'll want to before next week. And we look forward to all the wisdom that she will share with us about all the things that she's doing and how she's a change maker in multiple arenas. So check out Nona Jones next week. And in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your Heritage Month for Latinx community and continue to read authors from this community to help inspire you and give you a new perspective. Have a great week, everyone. Bye-bye. As we're finishing this episode, if you're thinking, I really wish I could learn more or go a little bit deeper, well, that's what our Difference Maker community is for. I would love to welcome you in to join the rest of us there. Once again, it's only $5 a month to join, the price of a latte at your local coffee shop. You can join at our Changers tier. Difference Makers is a community that really means so much to me. It's very special because each time I have a guest on the show, I record something outside of what we give to just the regular podcast audience, where we go a little bit deeper, and then I post those video episodes in this community and we can discuss them. But also at the very beginning tier, which is our Changers tier of this community, you'll get exclusive voting power and help pick podcast topics that give us, more of what we want from your perspective. You'll have access to exclusive 30 plus mini-sodes that aren't out there for the general public. And you'll get every month an exclusive monthly bonus mini-sode. At our Groundbreakers level, which is $10 a month, you can join and get all of that, but also priority access to submit questions to the podcast. And you'll get an additional 2 exclusive monthly bonus mini-sodes. And at our Trailblazers tier, which is $15 a month, the price of 3 lattes a month, you can get all of that, plus also 3 exclusive monthly bonus minisodes, and a patron shout out. So I would love for you to join us at any of those tiers. It'll help you come into this community, be in the midst of all of us, other difference makers, and we'd love to hear your perspective. I certainly would. It's a place to engage more with me and the audience around what you like, what you're resonating with, and once again, go deeper with each of our guests. So please join us in this membership community. I would love to hear your perspective and love to share this extra content with you. So show up at patreon.com/a world of difference.